The Grand Convocation Hall on Etherian Prime was a masterpiece of architectural artistry that made David Hartwell feel simultaneously impressed and intimidated. As humanity's newly assigned cultural envoy, he was responsible for navigating complex Etherian social protocols while representing human interests at ceremonies that blended diplomacy with cultural celebration in ways that could either strengthen interspecies relations or create incidents that destabilized the fragile peace process. David's appointment had come after his predecessor suffered what diplomatic reports diplomatically termed cultural adjustment difficulties, a euphemism that covered everything from protocol violations to what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown triggered by the pressure of representing humanity at Etherian court functions. The transition had left David with minimal preparation time and maximal responsibility for not making mistakes that could undermine years of careful diplomatic progress. The Etherians were an elegant species whose society revolved around formal beauty, artistic achievement, and the belief that aesthetic appreciation represented the highest form of cultural sophistication. Their diplomatic protocols required not just political competence, but also demonstrated appreciation for the artistic elements that they considered essential for meaningful communication between civilized beings. The Convocation Hall itself exemplified Etherian aesthetic philosophy, soaring crystal arches that captured and refracted light into patterns that shifted with the emotions and movements of the assembled representatives. The architecture seemed to respond to the proceedings, creating visual harmony that complemented the carefully choreographed interactions between diplomats whose every gesture carried both political and artistic significance. Lady Seraphina of House Viridian commanded attention without apparent effort, her presence serving multiple diplomatic and cultural purposes. As the collective's primary cultural representative, she embodied the aesthetic ideals that her people considered essential for diplomatic authority, while providing oversight that ensured proper protocols were maintained during interspecies interactions that could easily go wrong if cultural sensitivities were ignored. David had spent the morning observing the elaborate ceremonial protocols with careful attention to procedural requirements, trying to avoid the cultural missteps that could create diplomatic incidents. Etherian court functions operated according to complex rules of precedence, aesthetic presentation, and formal interaction that required participants to demonstrate not just diplomatic competence, but also cultural appreciation for the beauty that made meaningful communication possible. The ceremony had proceeded through traditional segments, the recognition of harmony, where both species acknowledged their commitment to peaceful coexistence, the celebration of achievement, where cultural accomplishments were formally appreciated, and the exchange of understanding, where diplomatic representatives demonstrated their commitment to continued cooperation through artistic and intellectual appreciation. David's prepared remarks about human admiration for Etherian cultural achievements had been carefully crafted to meet protocol requirements, while avoiding the kinds of personal comments that might be interpreted as inappropriate or culturally insensitive. His diplomatic training had emphasized the importance of maintaining professional distance, while demonstrating sufficient appreciation to satisfy Etherian expectations for meaningful cultural exchange. However, his concentration on procedural correctness had left him unprepared for the emotional impact of actually witnessing Etherian court culture in its full ceremonial magnificence. The combination of visual artistry, musical harmony, and choreographed interaction created an aesthetic experience that transcended his diplomatic expectations and touched something deeper than professional appreciation. The moment that changed everything occurred during the appreciation segment, when diplomatic representatives were expected to offer formal recognition of Etherian cultural achievements. David had prepared remarks about artistic excellence and cultural sophistication that satisfied protocol requirements while maintaining appropriate diplomatic distance. But as he watched Lady Serafina participate in the ceremony with graceful authority that combined political competence with genuine artistic expression, his prepared words suddenly seemed inadequate. Her movements carried both diplomatic significance and personal beauty that made the formal appreciation seem hollow and disconnected from the reality of what he was experiencing. Without thinking through the diplomatic implications of departing from his prepared remarks, David spoke directly from his emotional response to what he was witnessing. "You're the most beautiful woman here." The words carried across the convocation hall with crystalline clarity, reaching every representative present and creating an immediate silence that suggested either serious diplomatic crisis or something far more significant than simple protocol violation. Lady Serafina's reaction shocked everyone present, including David. Instead of expressing diplomatic offense at inappropriate personal comments or cultural concern about breach of protocol, she responded with formal announcement that transformed his spontaneous compliment into something entirely unexpected. "The honored human envoy has presented an esteemed petition in the ancient manner." She declared in ceremonial Etherian that the hall's translation systems rendered in harmonics that suggested profound cultural significance, offering personal recognition of cultural worthiness according to traditional protocols. "I accept this petition and invoke the consort witness bond as prescribed by our most sacred customs." The convocation hall erupted into controlled chaos as monitoring systems throughout the facility activated protocols that hadn't been used in centuries. Representatives from both species stared in amazement as ancient legal principles responded to what appeared to be accidental activation of ceremonial procedures that created immediate diplomatic and legal consequences. Ceremonial sensors detect consort witness bond activation, announced the hall's ceremonial system in harmonics that carried the weight of ancient authority. Aesthetic partnership established between cultural representatives. Emergency access to sealed diplomatic archives authorized. David watched with growing alarm as his diplomatic credentials were automatically paired with Lady Serafina's cultural authorities to unlock classified information systems and administrative networks that should have been far beyond his security clearance. The ancient protocols appeared to treat aesthetic appreciation between species as evidence of cultural bridge building that deserved special protection and extraordinary authority. "What exactly just happened?" he asked, studying readouts that showed his access permissions expanding to include databases and communication networks that definitely weren't part of normal cultural envoy responsibilities. "You've invoked the esteemed petition," Lady Serafina replied, her expression showing recognition mixed with something that might have been satisfaction or concern. "An ancient form of aesthetic partnership that creates immediate legal bonds between individuals who demonstrate genuine cultural appreciation across species boundaries." The automated systems continued their ceremonial recording, while granting David and Lady Serafina joint access to sealed diplomatic archives and humanitarian records that revealed patterns of systematic manipulation, affecting both species' cultural and diplomatic efforts. "The consort witness bond," she continued, studying the same expanding access permissions that were appearing on her ceremonial workstation, "grants shared authority over cultural and humanitarian matters affecting both our peoples. But the bond also creates obligations and responsibilities that neither of us chose or fully understand." As alarms sounded throughout the convocation hall and security protocols activated in response to their unprecedented access to classified information, David realized that his spontaneous appreciation of Lady Serafina's beauty had triggered legal and diplomatic consequences that extended far beyond cultural courtesy or aesthetic recognition. "Lady Serafina," he said, reviewing the classified information that their unexpected partnership had unlocked, I think my compliment may have accidentally revealed something much more significant than cultural appreciation. The evidence flowing through their newly shared access suggested that the cultural and humanitarian programs both species claimed to support had been systematically manipulated to prevent the kind of genuine cooperation that would threaten those who profited from maintaining artificial barriers and controlled separation between their civilizations. The consort-witness bond that had been activated by David's spontaneous compliment and Lady Seraphina's formal acceptance created unprecedented access to information that revealed systematic manipulation of cultural exchanges and humanitarian assistance designed to prevent genuine cooperation while maintaining profitable barriers between the species. The esteem petition isn't merely ceremonial recognition, Lady Seraphina explained during their first formal meeting following the unexpected bond activation, her voice carrying harmonics that David was learning to recognize as indicating complex cultural and legal significance. It creates legal partnership between individuals who demonstrate genuine aesthetic appreciation across species boundaries, granting them joint authority to investigate obstacles that prevent meaningful cultural and humanitarian cooperation. David discovered that his new status granted him access to sealed armistice ledgers and cultural exchange records that showed patterns of deliberate sabotage, designed to prevent the kind of understanding that would threaten those who profited from maintaining artificial separation and controlled hostility between their civilizations. These cultural exchange reports, he observed, studying documents that showed consistent patterns of administrative obstruction and bureaucratic interference. They document systematic prevention of artistic collaborations, educational programs, and ceremonial exchanges. Someone has been deliberately blocking the cultural cooperation that would build genuine understanding. Lady Seraphina's expertise in court protocols and cultural administration helped her recognize the sophistication of the manipulation, while David's diplomatic training allowed him to understand how specific decisions had been designed to maintain barriers that prevented aesthetic appreciation from developing into political cooperation. The humanitarian assistance records, Lady Seraphina discovered, accessing relief coordination files that their partnership had unlocked, show systematic falsification of need assessments and resource availability. The famine quotas we've been using to calculate aid bear no relationship to actual conditions in the affected regions. The evidence revealed that humanitarian crises affecting both species had been deliberately prolonged through administrative manipulation that prevented accurate assessment of needs, while maintaining artificial scarcity that justified continued emergency powers and resource control by officials who benefited from crisis management rather than crisis resolution. Look at these transportation and logistics manifests, David said, studying records that showed systematic diversion of cultural materials and humanitarian supplies. Art exhibitions, educational resources, medical supplies, they're all being rerouted through unauthorized channels that suggest coordination between officials who are supposed to be representing different governmental interests. Their investigation revealed a conspiracy involving human cultural officials and Etherian court administrators, who had been using aesthetic programs and humanitarian assistance as cover for smuggling operations that violated every principle of the ceasefire agreements while enriching those responsible for maintaining the cultural barriers that prevented genuine cooperation. The refugee settlement protocols, Lady Seraphina observed, studying displacement management systems that showed deliberate obstruction of assistance delivery. They've been designed to maintain rather than resolve humanitarian crises. The bureaucratic obstacles aren't inefficiency. They're systematic prevention of relief that would reduce the crisis conditions that justify emergency powers. The conspiracy extended beyond simple profiteering to comprehensive manipulation of both species' efforts to build understanding through cultural exchange and humanitarian cooperation. Programs designed to foster appreciation and assist vulnerable populations had been systematically corrupted to serve criminal enterprises that benefited from maintaining separation and controlled suffering. The aesthetic appreciation initiatives, David realized, studying cultural cooperation records that showed systematic sabotage. They've been undermined through deliberate scheduling conflicts, resource shortages, and administrative complications that prevent meaningful interaction between our peoples. Every program designed to build understanding has been sabotaged. The evidence showed how cultural exchange programs had been systematically corrupted to maintain artificial barriers rather than build bridges. Art exhibitions were canceled due to security concerns. Educational exchanges were delayed by procedural complications, and ceremonial interactions were constrained by protocol requirements that prevented genuine appreciation from developing. The consort witness bond, Lady Serafina explained as they continued uncovering evidence of systematic deception, grants us joint authority over cultural and humanitarian matters affecting both species, but using that authority would expose the conspiracy and make us targets for those who profit from maintaining artificial separation through aesthetic manipulation and controlled crisis management. David realized that their accidental partnership had revealed crimes that extended far beyond cultural insensitivity to systematic betrayal of both species' efforts to build genuine understanding and cooperation through shared appreciation of beauty, art, and humanitarian assistance for those in need. The ratification ceremony, he asked, understanding that their choice would determine whether they could expose the conspiracy or allow it to continue operating under cover of cultural protection and humanitarian concern. What would that require from us? A permanent commitment to cultural truth and humanitarian honesty, regardless of political pressure or personal cost, she replied, her expression showing both determination and awareness of the danger they faced. The ceremony would formalize our aesthetic partnership and grant us authority to override corrupted cultural and humanitarian systems, but it would also make us permanent enemies of those who profit from cultural manipulation and crisis management. Their conversation was interrupted by security alerts, indicating that their investigation had attracted official attention from representatives of both governments who were claiming that unauthorized access to cultural archives and humanitarian databases represented security violations requiring immediate investigation and possible prosecution. Multiple official transports requesting emergency docking clearance, reported the station's communication officer, his voice carrying tension that suggested the arrivals represented more than routine diplomatic visits. Human Cultural Security Authority and Etherian Court Protocol vessels. They're claiming jurisdiction over cultural exchange violations and ceremonial irregularities. David studied the approaching vessel's configurations, his diplomatic training helping him recognize that these were containment and extraction operations rather than cultural oversight missions. The speed and coordination of the response suggests that our investigation has threatened something much more significant than routine cultural security. David accessed personnel files that their paired clearance had revealed, cross-referencing the officials approaching the station with the financial records and communication logs that documented the cultural and humanitarian conspiracy. What he found confirmed their worst suspicions about who was behind the systematic manipulation. Cultural Director Richardson and Court Minister Velthane, he said, highlighting evidence that connected both officials to the conspiracy they'd uncovered. They're not coming to investigate our security breach, they're coming to protect themselves. Look at these authorization codes and financial arrangements. The evidence showed that the officials demanding their containment were themselves central figures in the conspiracy that had been using cultural programs and humanitarian assistance as cover for criminal activities, while publicly maintaining the appearance of aesthetic cooperation and humanitarian concern. The systematic manipulation, Lady Serafina realized, studying operational documents that revealed the true scope of the deception. It wasn't just about preventing cultural understanding. It was about maintaining control over both our species' aesthetic and humanitarian programs, to ensure that those who profit from separation and suffering could continue their operations indefinitely. As security forces from both governments approached the station, with clear intent to prevent their investigation from continuing, David and Lady Serafina faced the ultimate choice: formalize their aesthetic partnership to expose the cultural and humanitarian conspiracy that had been preventing cooperation while enriching corrupt officials, or allow themselves to be separated and silenced while systematic manipulation continued. The ratification ceremony would grant us legal protections under ancient Etherian law that both governments are treaty-bound to respect, Lady Serafina explained as hostile forces prepared to board the station. But the ceremony requires us to accept permanent responsibility for ensuring cultural truth and humanitarian honesty, regardless of official opposition or personal consequences. David studied the evidence they'd gathered, documented proof of systematic manipulation that had prevented cultural understanding while maintaining humanitarian crises, financial records showing coordination between supposed enemies, and operational plans that revealed ongoing conspiracies affecting both civilizations. If we don't ratify this bond, he asked, understanding the implications, what happens to the evidence we've gathered and the cultural and humanitarian programs both our peoples need? The evidence remains classified, our access is terminated, and both species continue relying on cultural and humanitarian systems that systematically prevent cooperation while enriching those who benefit from aesthetic manipulation and controlled crisis management, she replied, her expression showing the weight of a decision that could affect millions of lives. As extraction teams from both governments prepared to board the station and separate them before they could expose the truth, David realized that his spontaneous appreciation of Lady Serafina's beauty had revealed systematic betrayal that extended to the foundations of cultural and humanitarian cooperation between their species. Their choice would determine whether that betrayal could finally be exposed, or whether it would continue hidden beneath artificial barriers that prevented the genuine appreciation and assistance that both civilizations deserved. The situation at the Grand Convocation Hall escalated rapidly as extraction teams from both governments boarded the facility, with clear intent to prevent David and Lady Serafina from using their consort witness authority to expose the systematic manipulation of cultural and humanitarian programs that had been preventing genuine cooperation, while enriching those who profited from maintaining artificial barriers. Cultural Director Richardson led the human security team with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this was a critical containment operation rather than routine cultural oversight. His demeanor carried the controlled urgency of someone who understood that failure to suppress their investigation could have consequences extending far beyond individual careers or departmental protocols. Envoy Hartwell, Richardson announced with official authority that barely concealed his desperation to prevent further investigation. You are ordered to terminate your unauthorized access to classified cultural information and report for immediate extraction and comprehensive psychological evaluation. Your judgment has been compromised by exposure to alien aesthetic manipulation techniques. Simultaneously, Etherian Court Minister Velthane deployed ceremonial guards with orders to retrieve Lady Serafina and nullify what he claimed was unauthorized sharing of sacred cultural authorities, with an outsider who lacked proper understanding of Etherian aesthetic responsibilities and artistic obligations. Lady Serafina has violated sacred cultural traditions by extending consort witness recognition to an alien who cannot comprehend our aesthetic obligations. Minister Velthane declared with formal outrage that barely concealed his urgency to contain their investigation. The ancient ceremonies were designed for Etherian cultural masters who understand the spiritual significance of true aesthetic appreciation. As security forces from both governments positioned themselves throughout the convocation hall, David and Lady Seraphina realized that their investigation had attracted exactly the kind of official attention that confirmed their suspicions about who was behind the systematic cultural and humanitarian manipulation. The coordination and speed of the response suggested that Richardson and Velthane were working together despite claiming to represent opposing cultural interests. "Look at the communication protocols and tactical coordination," Lady Seraphina observed, studying displays that showed both extraction teams implementing joint containment rather than separate cultural oversight operations. "They're not maintaining species separation. They're conducting a coordinated operation to prevent us from exposing their collaboration." David accessed intelligence files that their bond continued to unlock, cross-referencing the officials demanding their separation with the financial records and communication logs that documented decades of systematic cooperation, disguised as cultural protection and humanitarian oversight. "Richardson and Velthane have been coordinating cultural sabotage for years," he said, highlighting evidence that connected both officials to the conspiracy they'd uncovered. "Look at these authorization codes and joint financial arrangements. They've been approving the systematic manipulation, while receiving payments from organizations that benefit from maintaining." Dawn arrived at the grand convocation hall with the kind of crystalline brilliance that made truth feel both inevitable and essential. David and Lady Seraphina stood in the ceremonial center, where his spontaneous compliment had first triggered the ancient protocols. Their ratification ceremony, proceeding despite extraction teams from both governments that surrounded the facility with orders to prevent exactly such a revelation of systematic cultural and humanitarian betrayal. The consort witness ratification demanded formal declaration of commitment to aesthetic truth and humanitarian honesty before representatives from both species, accepting permanent responsibility for ensuring that genuine cultural cooperation and assistance could flourish rather than being systematically corrupted by those who profited from maintaining artificial barriers and controlled suffering. Cultural Director Richardson and Court Minister Velthane coordinated their final attempt to prevent the ceremony, deploying security forces from both governments with orders to separate David and Lady Seraphina before they could formalize their aesthetic partnership and gain the legal protections that would allow them to override corrupted cultural and humanitarian systems without official interference. This ceremony represents a dangerous breach of cultural security protocols that threatens sensitive aesthetic and humanitarian information, Richardson declared, his forces maintaining containment positions while claiming to represent legitimate government authority. Envoy Hartwell has been compromised by alien cultural manipulation and must be extracted before he can share classified cooperation methodologies. Lady Seraphina has violated sacred cultural traditions by sharing protected aesthetic authorities with an outsider, Velthane added, his guards preparing to arrest her despite the ancient laws that protected Etherian ceremonial proceedings. These cultural rites were never intended for aliens who lack understanding of our aesthetic responsibilities and humanitarian obligations. As the ratification ceremony began, David and Lady Seraphina activated the emergency authority granted by their consort witness bond, using their combined access to override cultural security and broadcast accurate information about humanitarian needs and cultural cooperation opportunities to both governments simultaneously. The real scope of refugee crises and the potential for beneficial aesthetic exchange streamed out in real time, revealing that cooperation had been prevented by systematic manipulation rather than genuine incompatibility. "By the authority of our aesthetic partnership," Lady Seraphina declared, her voice carrying the formal harmonics required for Etherian ceremonial proceedings, "we expose the systematic manipulation of cultural and humanitarian programs that has prevented genuine cooperation, while corrupt officials profit from maintaining artificial barriers through aesthetic deception and controlled crisis management." David responded with words that accepted permanent responsibility for ensuring cultural truth and humanitarian honesty, regardless of political pressure, personal cost, or official opposition. "I ratify our bond and commit to aesthetic partnership that serves genuine appreciation rather than manipulation, choosing cultural integrity over profitable deception and humanitarian truth over controlled crisis management that enriches those who create the suffering they claim to address." The ceremony triggered automatic protocols throughout both governmental systems, as the evidence they broadcast revealed the systematic nature of Richardson and Velthane's conspiracy. The documentation included communication logs showing coordination between supposed cultural protectors, financial records proving massive profits from smuggling operations disguised as aesthetic programs, and administrative files that revealed forged humanitarian assessments designed to prevent adequate assistance while maintaining profitable crises. "The consort witness bond grants us permanent authority to override corrupted cultural and humanitarian systems," David announced as the ceremony concluded, and their partnership became formally recognized under ancient law that both governments were treaty-bound to respect. Lady Seraphina activated the cultural authority that their bond protected, immediately implementing humanitarian protocols that provided accurate assessment of refugee needs, while opening cultural exchange programs that allowed genuine appreciation to develop rather than being manipulated to maintain artificial barriers that served criminal interests. The evidence they broadcast triggered immediate humanitarian relief operations, as both governments discovered that refugee populations' actual needs far exceeded the forged quotas that had been used to justify inadequate assistance. While cultural exchange programs began operating according to their intended purpose of building understanding, rather than maintaining profitable separation through systematic deception. The refugee corridors are now operating with accurate need assessments, Lady Seraphina reported, monitoring humanitarian systems that had been corrupted by deliberate falsification. "The transparency protocols we've implemented ensure that displaced populations receive genuine assistance, rather than being maintained in artificial crisis conditions that benefit those who profit from managing, rather than resolving their suffering." The cultural cooperation programs are finally serving their intended purpose, David added, studying exchange initiatives that now facilitated genuine understanding rather than maintaining barriers. "The aesthetic appreciation requirements we established prevent manipulation, while allowing authentic cultural partnership to develop between our peoples." The conspiracy collapsed as investigations triggered by their evidence exposed systematic corruption throughout both cultural and humanitarian hierarchies. Richardson and Velthane found themselves facing charges of systematic deception, conspiracy to maintain artificial suffering, and betrayal of their people's trust in cultural and humanitarian institutions, while the networks of contractors and officials that had supported their operations faced comprehensive prosecution. 1 year later, David stood in the headquarters of the Interspecies Cultural and Humanitarian Cooperation Authority, reviewing reports from missions that had eliminated aesthetic manipulation and crisis management, while dramatically improving both cultural understanding and humanitarian assistance between species that had been artificially separated by systematic deception, designed to enrich corrupt officials. The new integrity protocols have eliminated forged humanitarian assessments while improving assistance delivery by over 500%, Lady Serafina reported, her expression showing the profound satisfaction that came from using cultural expertise to facilitate genuine cooperation rather than maintain artificial barriers. The transparency requirements we established ensure that aesthetic appreciation serves understanding, while humanitarian assistance actually reaches those who need it rather than being diverted to maintain profitable crisis conditions. The cultural exchange programs are now building genuine bridges rather than maintaining profitable walls, David added, reviewing specifications for cooperation initiatives that preserved cultural integrity while eliminating the manipulation that had prevented authentic appreciation from developing into meaningful partnership that benefited both civilizations. Their consort witness bond had created more than just aesthetic partnership. It had established a model for the kind of genuine cultural appreciation and humanitarian cooperation that made lasting peace possible between species that had been systematically prevented from discovering their fundamental compatibility through shared values of beauty, art, and compassion for those in need of assistance. Any regrets about calling me the most beautiful woman in the hall? Lady Serafina asked, noting the reports from facilities where their cooperation model had eliminated manipulation while improving both cultural understanding and humanitarian assistance. None, David replied honestly, watching data streams that showed millions of people whose lives had been improved by the elimination of artificial barriers and the provision of genuine assistance rather than controlled crisis management. Though I have to admit, when I complimented your beauty, I never expected it would lead to reforming interspecies cultural and humanitarian cooperation throughout both our civilizations. Your spontaneous aesthetic appreciation revealed the systematic betrayal that had been preventing our peoples from experiencing genuine cultural cooperation, while maintaining artificial suffering for profit, Lady Serafina agreed, her harmonics carrying the contentment that came from ensuring that beauty and compassion served truth rather than deception. The partnership that began with honest appreciation has evolved into something that ensures neither of our species will ever again be systematically deceived through cultural manipulation or humanitarian deception. The joint authority their ceremony had created continued to operate as a permanent safeguard against aesthetic manipulation and crisis management, while the cooperation capabilities they had developed ensured that both species could finally discover what genuine cultural understanding and humanitarian assistance could accomplish when artificial barriers were removed and truth was allowed to flourish. David's spontaneous appreciation of Lady Serafina's beauty had revealed not only systematic betrayal of both species' cultural and humanitarian efforts, but also the extraordinary potential for genuine cooperation when aesthetic appreciation and humanitarian compassion were allowed to serve their intended purposes rather than being corrupted to maintain